Welcome to the Action Network podcast. This is our best bets episode for the 2025 U.S. Open, teeing off this week at the beautiful Oakmont Country Club on the banks of the mighty Allegheny River, just northeast of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So get ready for shots of church pew bunkers, of thick rough, and probably Permanente Brothers sandwiches. If we're being honest, there's going to be some B-roll of that as well, as the greatest golfers in the world tackle one of the most difficult challenges in all of golf. I'm your host, Mike Calabrese. Today, I'm joined by two very special returning guests. First up, returning to the show is our golf betting expert, two-time Fantasy Sports Writer Association Golf Writer of the Year, and senior PGA analyst at Rotoballer. Follow him at Tee Off Sports. Welcome back to the show, Spencer Aguiar. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Michael. It's a pleasure to be able to run this back with you and Kyle. We had a great PGA Championships show, and I look forward to doing this again.
As I mentioned, we have these two incredible guests here. We're also joined by my colleague from Roto Grinders, a golf expert and one of the most talented data modelers in the golf game. You can follow him at KMurDFS. It's Kyle Murray. How are you doing, brother?
Yeah, I'm doing good. I'm excited to talk about this event with you. You mentioned the beautiful Oakmont. I think it'll look beautiful to us, but I'm not sure the players will feel the same way when they're going through what might be hell to them. But I'm excited to see these guys struggle a little bit. Always looking forward to the U.S. Open. It's always a brutal fest there, so I'm looking forward to it.
Before we get into Kyle's picks, or before we get into Spencer's model and looking for the top edges, whether it's outrights, top 5, top 10s, top internationals, head-to-head players to make or miss the cut, we're going to touch them all here in this episode. But before we get into that, a question for you. I'll start Kyle first. Is this the kind of course, in your opinion, that rewards golfers who can avoid trouble, or the kind of golfers that can pull a rabbit out of their hat and really scramble after a bad shot lands in that thick rough?
Yeah, I think this course is difficult to assess just because I think it's so difficult compared to even challenges that we've seen throughout the last couple of years. Obviously, we've seen so many videos on social media and whatnot. I've seen a couple people nominate this as the most difficult course of the century, which is always exciting to think about going forward. But personally, I just think for an event like this, I just think the cream is just going to rise to the top. So that's typically going to be the case of guys who can sort of be the best of both worlds. The guys who are going to be able to avoid trouble, but also trouble is going to be inevitable. I don't think anyone's going to be able to fully avoid it. I think people are going to hit good shots that end up in just terrible places. So I think you're going to have these guys be able to pull a rabbit out of the hat as well. So I think the best way I could probably answer it is, I think for the majority of the breakdown, I think it's typically going to be guys who can avoid trouble and hit the safe shots, know where to miss and whatnot. But also, again, I think great shots are going to lead to some really bad, unfortunate bounces and bad spots. So I do think, being able to pull off that magic when needed is also going to be, very crucial for this event.
Spencer, do you agree? Are you looking closer at those kind of golfers that will not beat themselves, or those magicians around the green and out of the rough that can really make what should be a bogey, double bogey back into a par? Who are you gravitating closer to? And does your model agree with you in that regard?
I think that's the $1 million question for this week. Like, when I looked at this course, you get presented with this all-around examination. Wayward drives are going to get punished. Short game acumen is going to get rewarded, and it's going to force players to think critically about what is the best way to salvage par. Because as Kyle alluded to, and as even you brought up, Michael, there are a million issues that are inevitably going to come into play throughout a round. One of the things that I wrote at the very beginning of the week in my Rotoballer article is I was talking about distance versus accuracy. So guys that could bomb and gouge this property versus guys that were going to find a lot of fairways. And one of the interesting notes of when I ran it into my model, I didn't see a massive difference in one of those two areas. I know you look at a 7,400 plus yard par 70 property, and naturally a lot of distance is going to come into play. And I would make the argument that if you're looking to actually win this tournament, distance is more important than accuracy. But one of the ways that I set up my model, and I ask this kind of as an and or setup when looking into distance or accuracy, is are you long and straight? If you're that's going to be the best blueprint for success. But the other question that I asked was, are you long or accurate? Because as long as you profile in one of those two areas, I think you're starting on the right foot of trying to take on this course. Now the question comes into play from your point, Michael, of what do we do and what are we looking for golfers that are going to be able to salvage pars? Because if you're inaccurate off the tee, for me, the number one thing that I noticed when trying to build out a model is the players that were either too short and also not accurate enough too much strain goes into that game. So when you're scrambling, those golfers are going to be more likely to be scrambling from 5 to 6 feet, needing to make bogey from there, where double bogey comes into play, where if you're really long or you're really accurate, you're kind of putting from 5 to 6 feet for par in a lot of those situations. So the ultimate reward are going to be the golfers that can handle the greens. The greens are the most challenging prospect of what makes this course difficult at the end of the day. So, I don't know, as Kyle kind of alluded to, I don't know if there's a singular answer one way or the other there, but it's that all around examination that I'm trying to find.
When you look at a golfer entering this tournament, playing at the absolute peak of their game, avoiding any mistakes, not beating themselves, obviously that starts with Scottie Scheffler, who is now being priced in that prime Tiger Woods kind of neighborhood, plus 250 to win a major. That's a non-starter for most gamblers, particularly because you can keep your money on the sideline, wait until Friday, and probably get a similar number, even if he's top 5 at that point. So the idea of tying up your money for 4 days without, the benefit of seeing a little bit of action, seeing how the rough is affecting the play of this entire field, if them cutting it down a little bit did have an impact. All that being said, with Scheffler, is there any way to play him this week? I'll ask you first, Kyle, whether from an outright perspective, from a head-to-head, or would you go with a strategy where it's more of a live bet mid-tournament?
Yeah, I think for me personally, I talked about this on the PGA Championship episode, where for me, how I play the PGA DFS angle, where I'll get a lot of my exposure to Scottie Scheffler over on that side. But I think from a pure betting perspective, I do agree with you 100%. I think the best way to approach that is to see how the first round, maybe even second round is, or maybe even hope that he gets off to a slow start. And because again, like, cream is probably going to rise to the top in an event like this, especially in a course like this. So I think, live betting Scheffler, especially after a round or maybe even 2, where maybe he gets off to a slow start or has a bad round, I think that's probably where the most value is going to come in. But I definitely agree. This plus 250, plus 275, I think is the best number out there right now. Probably something that, in my opinion, is very difficult to touch.
Spencer, to bring you in on this angle, Tiger, obviously in the early 2000s, when he was superhuman and just running away from the field and was the top rated golfer by a country mile, you could also make an argument at that time the rest of the PGA wasn't as strong as it is today. Do you think that Scottie deserves to be priced in this neighborhood, given the kind of competition and the players who could turn it on and have a great 4-day stretch and potentially win this thing and take it from him?
I mean, honestly, I don't think that the price is that egregious. Now, I agree with what Kyle talked about. Like, to me, 2.5 to 1, 3 to 1 is still going to be a little bit too short. We've seen historically where Scottie struggles the most is where he gets these courses that he deems to be unfair. And if you look at Oakmont specifically here for this example, there is an argument to be made. Like, there's 5-inch thick rough, and a lot of the misses that are going to be 2 yards off the fairway might put you right into that 5-inch thick stuff, to where if you miss 25 yards and you go completely wayward, there's some really bad spots that you can get yourself in, but a lot of that will be trampled down by the patrons that are just there to watch the golf. And that's the kind of golf that can sometimes just create more volatility. And I think when we're talking about volatility in a 2.5 to 1 number here with Scottie Scheffler, that's what makes it difficult. And I'm going to ask you this question very quickly, Michael, because I do think it's an important discussion to be had, because we can talk about what is fair value and what is not fair value. But I think people hear that conversation and you ask the question, and we both have now given answers of we are not going to bet Scottie Scheffler. We have viewed this as a tournament where we're going to try to take him on. That, by no stretch of the imagination, doesn't mean that both Kyle and I don't think Scottie Scheffler is the most likely person to win this tournament. Like, if I gave you this example right now, Michael, and let's just say Matt Mitchell, he's go-to guy here at Action for all things production. And honestly, when I was at Action, he was my go-to guy for everything that I did at the company. He gives you, Matt's a baller. He gives you $100,000 free roll for this tournament this week. He says you got to put all 100,000 on that on one player, and the payout for that is going to be exactly $100,000. I mean, there's no world, and I don't want to lead the witness in this position, but I assume there's no world with that sort of a setup that you're not taking Scottie Scheffler, correct?
Oh, I agree. And as someone who wears many hats here at Action Network, I also host the Payoff Pitch podcast with Sean Zerillo, and we get into it all the time. When you bet a lot, and as you guys do in golf, you're betting so many different angles on so many different tournaments, that the value proposition and the expected return on your money on certain bets, you got to spread out that risk over the course of a season, literally thousands of bets. And it's the reason why on a daily basis in Major League Baseball, we're not just betting Scooble every time. Or we're not just betting the best teams in baseball, because you have to pay a price, or at least vis-a-vis the market for, let's call it, an average team on a regular night in the bigs. So I understand your point. If he were to give me a free roll, I'm either going with Scotty or I'm going with Bryson in this tournament. I have this feeling it's going to be one of the two of them. But if you put a gun to my head and say I have to choose, how could you choose against Scotty? Because as I said, no one comes in hotter and no one is better in the will not defeat himself department, at least in my opinion, here in 2025. And this is a tournament that is just begging and a course to just eat people up and spit them out. You have one hole where you make one mistake and all of a sudden you have a double and it starts to snowball. I want to move away from any golfers who potentially have that on the menu. And Scotty has not shown that, at least this season. Now, this perfectly transitions into one question I had before we get into your top plays here for Oakmont and the U.S. Open, which is a golfer who's trending in the opposite direction, and that's Rory McIlroy. Ever since getting the career Grand Slam and winning the Masters, he has just not seemed to be there in terms of consistency, in terms of focus, and even in his interviews. And I know you don't want to put too much stock in what people are saying off the course, but it just does not seem by any metric that he is locked in headed into this tournament. Is there value, or I should frame it differently, is there a price point in which him missing the cut would start to interest you? Let me ask you first, Kyle.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the miss the cut line there, I think that's sort of a spot where, for me, where my model grades out Rory, there's definitely, trends that are allowing other players to sort of compete with him or even, surpass him, and where I sort of rank him amongst the guys in this field. But yeah, in terms of, looking out for someone to miss the cut, I do think in terms of these guys up top, he sort of fits the bill for somebody who has that volatility, right? Like, sure, we've seen Rory have the volatility work in his favor, especially, at the Masters or, over the course of his career, where he has those really, really high highs, right? But of these, top 3-4 guys, he's probably the one that I think is most likely to, falter here, especially with the recent play. So yeah, I think amongst these top 3 or 4 guys, he would probably be the guy I would be looking at first in terms of, miss the cut prop here.
I believe you were saying it was consensus 5-2 for him to miss the cut. Does that interest you, Spencer?
I don't know if I necessarily have a strong take on this one way or the other, but the one thing I want to say about Rory, because I kind of have been making this point from the very beginning part of the season, and I understand we have 3 huge wins this year. Masters completes the career Grand Slam, Players Championship, AT&T at an elevated event. You add all of those pieces together, and we got Rory into this price zone to where, I mean, he was 5-6 to 1 to win some of these events. And one of the arguments I kept making is if you look at the statistical profile of Rory McIlroy this year, which is an elite profile, it's very similar to the profile in 2024, but there are a few glaring differences that are at least noteworthy to look at. So you look this year, plus 1.485 strokes gained per round, third on tour behind Sepp Straka, very surprisingly second there. Scotty Scheffler, number 1. Last year, plus 1.412 was behind Xander, behind Rory. The thing that metric does not tell is he is worse on his approach statistics. He is worse around the green. Even as elite as he's been off the tee, he's about 0.10 strokes per round worse off the tee than he's been. And really a lot of what this uptick has been seen from him has come from the putter. 0.512 strokes per round. That's versus 0.173 last year. So you add all of that up, you don't quite get to this total, but he's nearly a stroke and a half better per tournament this season with the putter than he was last year. And a lot of that bodes well, I do think, maybe for safety in this spot. Like, unfortunately, what ended up happening, because at the RBC Canadian Open, I thought he was one of the worst values on the board. I thought we had reached this point to where entering this tournament potentially here at the US Open, forget the miscut for a second, I thought this was going to be the prime sell-off spot against Rory where all matchups were going to make sense. We've seen matchups in the space right now where John Rahm is already out to minus 150 against him. Like, the market has reacted very heavily, and I think it's a correct version of where it's moving. Like, for me, Rory is more of this 12 to 15 to 1 player that he has moved to versus the 6 to 1 price. And the other thing that I just want to at least throw out there for this conversation is 40 plus professional wins. If you go and you look how many of those wins have come in single digits, and we can make the argument of how difficult this course will actually play, he has 0 victories that have come inside of a single digit range. And a lot of that stems from when Rory wins, he catches fire. There are tournaments where Rory has gotten to 14 under par, where your next closest competitor is 4 under. And so maybe that's taking numbers and skewing them in the favor. But like, I do agree with both of you, at least in the very vacuum situation of this answer. Like, of the big name contestants in this tournament, he is my least favorite of the options. He probably would have to get into like the 20-1 range plus, just with where my model views him, for him to be a value. And it kind of goes back to what the Scotty example that I was trying to bring up comes into play. Like, I asked that analogy and brought up that example with Scotty because you answered it perfectly, Michael. Like, at the end of the day, prices matter. Exposure to the board matters. Trying to find value is the ultimate goal. So if there is not value on Scotty, can we find value elsewhere? And if there's not value on Rory, then let's move into a different spot again. And that's how I built my model this week. That's what my model told me, is that there were values in other spots. And it doesn't mean that I'm necessarily opposing Scotty if we move back to him. It's just, Kyle said it, like, get DFS exposure to him, get overweight in that area. There's different ways to play him. It doesn't need to be at 2.5-1.
Do you ever watch sports and find yourself wishing that there was a way to get into the game? Well, with Underdog, there's finally a way to make picks on sports without leaving the house. The game is in your hands. To play, choose whether a player will go higher or lower on a specific stat, like touchdowns, strikeouts, points scored, and more. They've got all your favorite leagues, teams, and stars to choose from. You can create entries with all baseball picks or mix and match across sports. You can play it with as little as $1, and if you get everything right, you can win up to 1,000 times your money. So you can turn that $1 into $1,000 just with your sports knowledge. I've been playing Underdog to spice up those afternoon games in the bigs. Special thanks to Dansby Swanson for helping my bankroll with 4 dingers this month already. And that's the beauty of Underdog. You can ride the hot hand in any sport, from the NBA and NHL playoffs to Major League Baseball every day of the week. Underdog has you covered. Download the Underdog app and sign up now using promo code ACTIONNETWORK to unlock a special offer for up to $1,000 in bonus cash when you make your first deposit. Join in on the fun when you sign up with promo code ACTIONNETWORK. Claim your special offer and get up to $1,000 in bonus cash instantly upon your first deposit. Must be 18 plus, 19 plus in Alabama and Nebraska, 19 plus in Colorado for some games, 21 plus in Massachusetts and Arizona, and present in a state where Underdog Fantasy operates. Terms apply. Concerned with your play? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit ncpgambling.org. In Arizona, call 1-800-NEXT-STEP or text NEXT STEP to 53342. In New York, call the 24/7 Hope line at 1-877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY. All right, we got all our negativity out at the beginning of the pod. We kind of said, the value proposition doesn't make sense with Scotty. We're poking holes in Rory's game coming in. Let's start talking about some of the golfers that we're excited to bet. Hope springs eternal here a few days before the first player tees off at Oakmont. So give me some players in, let's call it the top 10 to 15 of this tournament board that have interest you. I'll start with you, Spencer.
So I did an Action Network show for the Olympics last year. I made a very similar argument to the one I'm going to bring up here. Unfortunately, yes, we've had this Scotty Scheffler discussion of him potentially not necessarily winning at that price. And Scotty won the Olympics at 3-1. But what I talked about on that show was how Jon Rahm was the forgotten star of that field. And in that particular tournament, you could grab him at 16-1. That's a 3-1, as I talked about on Scotty. It was 7-1 totals on Xander and Rory. And at the end of the day, a loss is going to end up being a loss. But if you look at that tournament and the way it played out, and Kyle even talked about this at the PGA Championship where he was on Rahm, and he definitely was ahead of the market curve that we have seen take place here. Rahm had the medal around his neck. You could argue, yes, at the Olympics, but he even was a very big front runner there entering the back nine at the PGA Championship. And it just did not come together for him. Scotty clutched up. Rahm missed a couple putts, but I think a lot of those sentiments are going to hold true here when we handicap the board for the U.S. Open. Look at Rahm specifically. He's fallen into this territory over the last few years of, I think he's viewed as a golfer that is beneath Bryson DeChambeau. And maybe that is fair when you consider Bryson. He's put himself in the contention to win almost every major outside of last year's Open Championship. But more of what my model seems to be looking at is there is this world of past ROM success that we have started to see this year, and then the current form of the statistical profile that is beginning to mix in for a golfer who, when I ran this tournament, he was the second highest win equity choice that I had on the board. That was a total that marginally squeaked past DeChambeau. They were very similar to one another, not much of a difference. But when one guy opened at 14-1, you're going to be looking more in that 12-1 range now, and DeChambeau's more 7 or 8-1. The value for me stood more with Jon Rahm. And I think at the end of the day, the overall success from him is going to stem from his ability to regain that high level of driving that we used to see from him week in and week out on the PGA Tour. When he won the US Open in 2021, he was the number one projected grader in my model for strokes gained off the tee that week. You're not going to necessarily get that purely when using major championship form over the last season or two if you're running numbers, but there are a lot of those metrics that I talked about to where if we look at the live production, you look at the domination of what he put together at Quail Hollow off the tee. To me, that's kind of an indication of a driver that's finally regained form. And if that ends up being the case, like, not to go back to the Rory discussion, but if we're looking at Rahm versus Rory 1-1, I think Rahm makes so much more sense to go in that direction at the top of the board than a name like Rory would. There's two other names that I took this week in that, we'll call it like sub 40-1 range. I took Joaquin Niemann at 35-1 on Monday. We've seen that dip more into the low 30s at this point. But one of the arguments that everybody wants to make with Niemann is this lack of major championship success. And I say it every single time. It's a very lazy narrative that comes into play. And look, I'm not going to sit here. I'm not going to give him a ton of credit for backdooring a top 10 at the PGA Championship when he shot himself out of this tournament after day one. Still, the note that I at least want to add to that is performances are meant to grow over time. And I'm kind of under this belief that we would view Niemann in a very similar light as we view Xander Schauffele before he won his first two major titles last season. If he hadn't left for live, and instead we kind of view him in this same, we'll call it like a darkness here, where all those negative viewpoints of not winning or not competing when it matters most comes into play. But I think you can make a really strong argument here that Niemann is a legitimate top 5 win equity golfer in this tournament. And it's a name because of that lack of major championship pedigree has pushed too far into this 30-1 range. And then the last golfer I'll talk about for this section, I would be very stingy with how much you want to allocate funds to this golfer over the course of a season. It's not a name that I back very often, but I did take Tommy Fleetwood at 40-1. I thought this was a very similar route. If you look at Matthew Fitzpatrick's profile when he won the 2022 US Open, it's a very comparable route here for Tommy Fleetwood when we look at price, trending form, all of that comes together. And when I took all the metrics and I graded them all together, my model ranked Fleetwood next to Rahm and Xander as one of only 3 players to crack the top 30 for all 4 of the strokes gained categories that I ran. You include that to adding an additional return for weighted scrambling. Like we've talked about why scrambling matters. The ability to salvage par from within 30 yards is going to come into play over and over again. So I made this argument for Xander, it feels like, for years before he finally got himself across the finish line. But I've often said that close calls are probably as much bad luck as they are bad play over extended attempts. So, none of that necessarily means that Fleetwood, this is going to be the time that he gets himself over the finish line. But I do think that there is something to be said about a course that is more difficult, that during this go around on Sunday, it may present the Fleetwoods of the world a little bit more upside than you normally would get.
Yeah, transitioning to that final point for your picks here, Kyle, in terms of players at the top of the board, let's call it the PGA top 20 rankings right now, golfers that have been positively impacted from an odds perspective by Scheffler going off at such short odds. When you looked at it, were there certain numbers and thresholds that you needed to see, and then you were pleasantly surprised when these numbers started to pop earlier in the week?
Yeah, definitely. I think, we touched on this in the PGA Championship breakdown as well, where there was a couple guys, sort of, 2 or 3 guys taking so much of that win equity out to where that typical top tier of guys, like we're talking about guys like Jon Rahm, even the Xanders of the world, where these are bona fide top 10 golfers who are seeing value because you have Scottie Scheffler taking up so much of that win equity this week. And, just to piggyback off that play, we're going to sound like a broken record here, but I'm also backing Rahm and Niemann this week again. So, like I mentioned for the PGA Championship, I backed him John Rahm that week as well. Had the T8 finish. I was expecting more out of him. Obviously, he kind of had that blow up of the last 3-4 holes there. But, Rahm is a guy who I just continue to see value on here based on his, ability to ball strike with the best of the world. And I think when you look at guys, when you're talking about outright betting, I think volatility is often viewed, with a downside, right? But, in reality, I like to chase volatility because when you have that volatility work in your favor, that's when you can compete with the Scotty Schefflers and the Brysons of the world. So I think Rahm, sure, he definitely has, a wider range of outcomes, but I think that actually benefits him in the outright market here. So I like the value that I'm seeing on John Rahm. And he's also been a guy who has, played very well in majors, finishing T14 or better in 7 of his last 11 majors. So I know, we know the upside is, good enough to compete and be in contention in these majors. We know he has the game to win a U.S. Open type event, as he won the U.S. Open in 2021. It ranks as 3rd in total strokes gained in my model and 2nd as the best off the tee player, 3rd in tee to green play. So checking all the boxes for someone who has the ability to win a U.S. Open. So backing John Rahm again, like I did at the PGA, and backing Niemann as well. So me and Spencer are in lockstep here. Joaquin Niemann, I mean, if you guys have been following any of my PGA plays for any amount of time, I would like to say I'm one of the biggest Joaquin Niemann stands out there. I mean, he's the guy who I bet on a ton. Obviously, when he left for Live, I was pretty disappointed. But, seeing him as a guy who grades out well is, very unsurprising. He grades out as the 4th best golfer in my model for me this week. And I truly believe he has a game built to win in majors. And although, like Spencer alluded to, we haven't really seen it. And I think I could not agree more when he says the term lazy narrative. I mean, we've seen that time and time again, especially in the golf world, where, the one I like to think back to was, even Tony Finau not being able to win, Rory McIlroy not being able to close out on Sundays. Just so many times people just see things on TV, and obviously, emotions can, impact a lot of reactions to things, especially in the golf world where things can be so, cut and dry and so 0 to 100. And I think that's something that Niemann sort of benefits from in the market, where we get a little bit of a discount. But when you look at just what he puts in on paper from a resume standpoint, he's by far a top 10 ball striker in this field. And more importantly, he's top 5 in strokes gained approach of shots of over 200 yards, which I think is going to be a crucial point for me this week. So that's a huge, standing point there for Niemann. But I think he actually benefits in a course like this that I do think is going to eat the field alive, because the one weakness that we've seen with Niemann in these majors is he sort of fails to convert on birdies. So when we're seeing scores be a little bit lower at times, he tends to fall behind a little bit. But I think on a course where, birdies are going to be at an extreme premium, I think it's actually going to benefit a guy like Joaquin Niemann, who is a very stable golfer, can go out and make pars with the best of them. So I do think Niemann benefits from this sort of event here at Oakmont and in the U.S. Open. And I love the number here at 35 to 1 on DraftKings. I think it's down to 30 to 1 now, but love the Niemann number. And the last guy I'll throw out there in the top 15 or so in odds for me is Shane Lowry. I think he's sort of a guy who is sort of doesn't fit the bill that the Niemanns and the Rahms do, that he can, smash the ball a million miles down there. But if we do see an event where, accuracy is key, where staying out of trouble and hitting fairways is truly, the ultimate, the key here, I think Lowry could benefit there. And again, I touched on the approach buckets there for Niemann, but Lowry, while he doesn't have the distance off the tee ranking outside the top 100, he's in the top 11 in terms of good shot percentage on approach shots of over 200 yards. So I do think that weakness can sort of be counteracted by his elite long iron play. He's top 20 in driving accuracy. So I do think he's able to hit fairways, avoid trouble. And obviously we've seen Shane Lowry be a guy who can pull the rabbit out of the hat and have those magic around the greens as well. And also I think his long iron play, I think a big thing for Lowry is as well, he also hasn't really shown that acumen to finish four full rounds of major events. But again, I still think that he's a guy who has the game to sort of win these tougher events and compete at these difficult courses. And we've seen him do so at difficult courses over the course of the past couple of years on the PGA Tour. So I like Lowry here at 50 to 1 as well.
All right, it's clear we are now a Niemann official podcast, but let's expand our search here for a potential winner into the mid-tier and long shot category. Spencer, which golfers really piqued your interest? And this is what is special about betting on golf. For the casuals who are only betting the majors out there, this is the dream. You want to hit the 80, the 100 to 1, and to really make your entire summer in terms of being able to build up your bankroll before the NFL season starts. This is what they're looking for. So if you're listening, turn up the volume a little bit as Spencer walks through some of his longer shot plays.
I mean, I would say, like, just to double down on that thought, Michael, like, probably one of the crowning jewel moments that I've had in this space is when I took Wyndham Clark to win the US Open a couple of years ago at 100-1. So, like, it's difficult to get across the finish line in these majors, but, like, here is a stat that I'd at least like to throw out there when we're looking at the US Open specifically. So, take the last 16 winners of this tournament, just a little bit under 50% of those names, when they won the US Open, to that answer to where we are now, have only captured one major. So that's names like Webb Simpson, Lucas Glover. Those are maybe more so the Webb Simpson example there, where those are like the poster returns for these golfers that are, let's call them top 25, top 30, top 40 golfers in the world, but they enter the week as these triple digit marks with, call it like no real expectation to actually win this and get across the finish line, but a ranking that is a lot better than you would think they should be for where it would be. So there are a lot of names. Like, I know Keegan has a major, but like, if we're just talking about names here that are these triple digit targets, and when I start with Rahm and Neiman and Fleetwood, there's only so many directions I can go. I don't like overexposing my card, but I think that there are probably like 5, 6, 7 names, like just at the top of my head, past the name that I'm actually going to give that I bet this week, that I considered very heavily in this triple digit zone. And, you know, if you want to bet them, you have extra room on the card, like Keegan Bradley, Daniel Berger, Robert McIntyre, Taylor Pendrith, Maverick McNeely. All of those names fit kind of that narrative of what I'm talking about in some direction. But for the sake of this discussion, I ended up taking Harris English at 100-1. Look at the way that English has played these U.S. Open tests in the past. You'll see he's been inside the top 8 in 3 of his last 5 attempts. The statistical profile is also going to tell a very similar story. And what I am most intrigued about that return is my model is not one that necessarily loves English in a lot of these spots. So when you get these outlier sort of returns, I guess is the way that I would call it with English, to where all of a sudden he's, you know, a top 20 projected win equity player on the board, and he's a name that should be sub 100-1. Like, that usually means something to me. And the reason why that return came into play is he graded top 15 for expected strokes gained total in my model. He was also inside of that top 15 category for weighted scrambling, and then projected driving plus putting, which was kind of the interesting return there. And maybe it shouldn't be, because I talked about it at the beginning. I looked at how somebody could either get distance, which is not going to be the English game, or provide accuracy, which is going to be more of what he provides. And I also looked at similar tests that have thick rough, these more narrow fairways. And there is a reason why, like, Oakmont is one of your prototypical through and through US Open sort of tests, where it's going to demand some sort of driving acumen off the tee. Now, we can argue whether that's distance or accuracy that plays the bigger account, but you're going to need to be a quality driver of the ball. And I talked about it when talking about this venue and the defense of the venue. The putting is what really matters here. It's going to be quick greens. Like, think of, they're almost going to be like glass top if this ends up getting baked out and doesn't get wet. And English at these difficult courses has always seemed to find success. So you're asking for a lot for him to be able to win, but I kind of view this, and even any of those other names, if you have other abilities to throw extra darts at this board, there is an outlook at this tournament to where if this gets volatile enough, you can find a Maverick McNeely, a Daniel Berger, a Harris English, one of these names that ends up winning this tournament. So I'm going to go with Harris English for this discussion, but I kind of like everybody that I threw out there.
Kyle, any names that potentially are diamonds in the rough here that you could turn into not necessarily a winner? I mean, that's what we're all going for, and you're betting the outrights, but obviously it gives you great hedge potential. If you have a leader after 36 holes that's 125-1, it gives a host of possibilities to be able to extract some value from a ticket like that. So anything in that 100-1 neighborhood that's, you know, sparked your interest.
Yeah, I think Spencer broke it down perfectly. When, you know, it's difficult to find a winner, especially in an event like this down here, but there are a couple of names that, you know, if you are looking to sprinkle on, he mentioned English. Love that call there. Berger's a guy who I have a sprinkle on there, but there's 2 names that really stand out for me that I think have a lot of value based on my model. And the best value on an outright bet in my model this week is Keegan Bradley. And I think that's basically just strictly because of, you know, the 100-1 odds that we found on him early in the week. I think he's down to 90-1 now on DraftKings, but early in the week, nobody had better value based on where he projected in my model. I believe I had him as the 11th highest win equity player in this field, which seems like a very aggressive number for Keegan Bradley. But when you look at some of the things that we've been talking about so far on the show, Spencer mentioned the intriguing combination of distance and accuracy. And so far in this field, in my model on driving accuracy and driving distance, there's only 2 players in this field inside the top 40 in both of those categories. Keegan Bradley leads both of those categories. They're in the top 40. Him and Tyrrell Hatton are the only 2 inside the top 40. So love Bradley's numbers here. Obviously, when you talk about Keegan Bradley and his struggles, you got to look at the putting greens, right? We touched on how difficult it's going to be on the greens here. But I do think in a world where it's difficult for everybody and everybody's going to struggle putting, that sort of mitigates some of the risk that you have with the weakness of Keegan Bradley on the greens. And he's also a guy who, again, volatility. We've seen him pop with the putter, right? At Muirfield, we saw him gain strokes putting. He had a T7 finish there. At the API, he popped with a good putting week, T5. At the Players, also gained strokes putting, had a T20 there. So when he does perform well on the greens, or when he's at least not losing badly on the greens, we all know Keegan Bradley is a guy who can ball strike with the best of them. And I do think his elite combination of distance and accuracy will allow him to, have some of those weaknesses on the greens sort of, I guess, and come out to a net positive for him with his ball striking there. He grades out as a top 10 tee to green player in my model, 12th in strokes gain total in my mixed strokes gain model. So love Keegan Bradley this week at 100 to 1. I believe it's 90 to 1 now. And then the last guy I'll mention, again, another guy who definitely does not benefit from the distance off the tee, but he's been playing extremely well. Ben Griffin, kind of riding the hot hand here at 75 to 1. Now, not many golfers playing better than Ben Griffin right now, finished T8 at the PGA. But more importantly, what I saw with his second place finish at the Memorial is something that I think could actually translate well here. Memorial at Muirfield, also a course with difficult roughs and difficult greens. Ben Griffin played very well at that course, but more importantly, again, a guy who does not benefit from the distance. He is a strong putter, but more importantly, he ranks inside the top 12 in strokes gained approach on shots of 200 plus yards, which is what I'm looking at when I'm trying to find players who might not necessarily have the distance, but will be able to sort of benefit from the accuracy. So if you don't have the distance and the accuracy, I'm looking for a guy who can hit those long irons extremely close and gain strokes on those longer approach shots, which I think is going to be very crucial here. I mean, we're going to see some par threes give these guys absolute hell. So I do think Ben Griffin's a guy who can definitely play himself into some positive strokes there with those long iron approach shots.
All right, guys, you have walked through just, a host of golfers who potentially win this tournament, assuming that Scotty doesn't run away with it. But this is an opportunity to throw in the best of the rest. This is your top tens. You're making the cuts, your head-to-heads, potentially best European golfer, anything under the sun in terms of an exotic or a specialized market that you enjoyed leading up to this and you just couldn't resist pulling the trigger on. I'll start with you, Kyle.
Yeah, a couple of matchup plays I like. I like Joaquin Niemann over Tommy Fleetwood, -110. I also like Xander over Ludwig at -125. And then some guys who I have some sprinkles on and some outrights, but mainly guys who I'm looking in the top 20 and top 40 markets. Daniel Berger, Harris English, Akshay Bhatia, and I like Chris Gotterup to make the cut this week.
How about you, Spencer? What else is on your card that just can't wait to talk about it?
I mean, it feels like Kyle and I give very similar answers throughout these first 2 shows that we've done. So I looked at the made cut, missed cut market and the 5 best names value-wise to make the cut. And I only gave 2 of them, but I will give who the best 5 were according to their number. Chris Gotterup was the best value that I had on the board to make the cut when he was +120. Bud Cauley was second. Matthew McCarty 3rd, Sam Stevens 4th, Max Grazerman 5th. So what I ended up doing, and we're always playing this game when we record shows deeper into the week where numbers move. I ended up betting Bud Cauley in a matchup over Gary Woodland. I don't know how usable that is for anybody listening at this point. I think it's out to the -150, -160 sort of a range. Unfortunately, I got it in the -120, so it's a bit of a value difference there. But for head-to-head matchups, just in general, I was trying to find some of these past champions, the Gary Woodlands of the world, the Justin Roses, names that I could take on where I think there's more public perception value than we actually have for them in this tournament. So those are options that I'm looking to take on. And then just to add to that make cut list, I ended up using my exposure for Cauley over Woodland, but I took Chris Gotterup +120, and then I took Matthew McCarty to make the cut at +110.
Thanks for listening to our Best Bets episode for the 2025 U.S. Open at Oakmont. If you haven't, be sure to check out Stuckey and Raybon's exhaustive 4-part preview of AFC and NFC win totals from earlier this week. You can check it out right here on the same podcast feed. And, of course, a special thanks to our sponsor, Underdog Fantasy. Best of luck with all your bets, and we'll see you here next time at the Action Network podcast.